Welcome to this session of the Tortoise COVID Inquiry. I'm Chris Cook. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. This session is going to focus on what went wrong with education. Schools were shut down, we cancelled exams, we tried to work out how to give grades to children for exams they didn't take. We've had a huge loss in learning as schools attempted to go online during lockdown. Then in September, we shipped off students to universities in record numbers, only to turn those universities into COVID hotbeds and then imprisoned students in their halls. All the while, Gavin Williamson has not exactly been an ever-present on our screens. This is a bit different to normal thinking, as you'll probably know if you've been to our previous sessions. We're going to start with a prosecution case and a defense case made by our two lawyers. I should be clear, these are not their personal opinions. They have been called off the taxi rank to do this. Making the prosecution case today is Tasneem Akunji, who's a criminal defense solicitor working in the field of terrorism and terrorism-related offending. Making the case for the defense is Alexi Mustras, my colleague, who is no longer practicing but has been called, like Cincinnatus, from his field to take on this important task of defending the government's handling. The key to this is that we're not going to be running this as a normal thinking. We're going to be looking for people who have direct experience of the issues at hand, rather than, if you like, esoteric thoughts. So we're looking really for witnesses. If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please go into the chat and we'll come to some of you as and when we can. We've also brought with us a couple of expert witnesses to get things going. We have Tilly Brown, who is the primary head at Reach Academy Felton, a free school for 2 to 18-year-olds. She's a former Teach Firster, and she's recently been working on the Oak National Academy, which is something that may come up a bit later. That's an online schooling platform to support teachers to teach online. We've also got Peter Hyman. Peter has been, I think, basically everything in education. He's now the executive head of School 21. He's previously been a deputy head. He's previously been a teacher, previously a teaching assistant. And then before that, he worked in Downing Street. So not totally the normal career path. We also have Gemma Moss, who is a professor of literacy at UCL's Institute of Education. She has long-standing interest in how policy impacts on professional practice in education. And she has particular interest around gender and literacy and assessment, all big things that have been at issue over the last few months. So I'm going to start by asking Tasneem to kick us off, if I can, to make the case for the prosecution about why it is that the government, well, I'll let him speak, but why the government failed to do what it needed to do on education.
Well, thank you very much. I think to set the scene, we just need to cast our minds back really to December 2019, when we saw COVID first appear as an issue over in Wuhan, China, and then with horror watch it appear across into Europe from December to February, particularly in Spain and Italy. And at the time, governments across the world were considering, well, what would our response be to COVID? Do we lock down or do we not lock down? Now, we had Neil Ferguson's mathematical model, which predicted that if we didn't lock down, we'd have 500,000 deaths. And that was in March. On March 17th, our government convenes a COBRA meeting and eventually announces that actually we would be locked down, and particularly that schools will be shut down, would only remain open for the care and educational needs of key workers and vulnerable children. Now, on the same day, on the 18th of March, Gavin Williamson told MPs that assessments of exams would not go ahead this year and performance tables would not be published. He further stated that officials were working with exam boards to ensure that children get the qualifications they need. So a couple of days later, on the Friday, schools were then shut down on the 20th of March. So regarding that issue, well, what did the exam boards come up with? Really, how do you provide assessments that will allow A-level students to go into university without exams being conducted? And what they came up with was that they would have teachers supply for every pupil, for every subject, an estimated grade based upon previous performance in school, and have the teachers ranked compare each pupil in their class with every other pupil in their class with respect to their estimated grades. Now, those results would then be put through an algorithm, which also factored in the school's performance in each subject over the previous 3 years. Now, the idea was that the grades this year, even without exams, would be consistent with how schools had done in the past. The teacher's ranking would decide which pupils received the top grades in that particular school. And similar algorithms were applied for people in Wales and Northern Ireland. They were also used in Scotland for the Scottish Highers qualification. Now, Ofqual said that this was a more accurate way at the time of awarding grades than simply relying on teachers' assessments. And they argued that teachers were more likely to be generous in assigning an estimated mark, and that might lead to grade inflation, a much higher number of pupils getting top grades. And so they needed to have this algorithm put in place in order to mitigate against that and hopefully reach sort of parity with previous year's experience. But what actually happened was when A-level grades were announced in England and Wales and Northern Ireland on the 13th of August, nearly 40% were lower than the teachers' assessments. There were similar issues in Scotland as well. In England, 36% of entries had a lower grade than teachers recommended, and 3% were down 2 grades. What was more is that the downgrading affected state schools much more than the private sector. Now, of course, so that its objective for A-level results was to ensure that the national results were broadly similar to previous years, but by basing it so much around previous school performance, a bright student from an underperforming school is likely to have their results downgraded through no fault of their own. Likewise, a school which was in the process of improvement would also not have seen this progress resulting in grades reflected. Now, in Scotland, they had an even bigger sort of issue where figures showed that the higher pass rate for pupils for most deprived backgrounds, was reduced by 15.2 percentage points. And that was compared with only 16.9 percentage points for the wealthiest pupils. So the question was, well, why did it benefit private schools so much? Private schools were identified as usually selective, so they select for aptitude anyway, and they have much smaller class sizes and are better funded, and in most years will outperform in terms of exams the state sector anyway. Now, the algorithm, because it was based on past performance, would put students from these schools at an advantage compared with their state school equivalents. The question was this at all foreseeable? Now, Gavin Williamson was warned in a letter in early July that the algorithm used by Ofqual would only be 75% accurate at best. Now, the former Department for Education Director, Sir John Cole, informed Williamson that the algorithm risked getting hundreds of thousands of results wrong, and that the system would likely advantage small cohorts, such as private schools, in any event. And Ofqual's own test on its own algorithm found that it was only 60% accurate. So the schools minister, Nick Gibb, confirmed that he'd been warned about the algorithm before the results day, and particularly confirmed that Sir John spoke to me about it, and he was concerned about the model, and he was concerned that it would disadvantage particularly children from poorer backgrounds. Gibb confirmed that he called a meeting with Ofqual, the independent regulator, to discuss in detail those concerns, and further confirmed that it was clearly and certainly foreseeable that private school pupils would benefit from the use of the algorithm. So despite the disparity in how the algorithm affected rich and poor pupils, Mr. Gibb, though, however, defended the model as fair, but said it was implemented incorrectly. Gibb then added that the model was popular and widely consulted upon. Now, Scotland and Wales abandoned the algorithm pretty quickly and reverted back to teacher assessments alone. And eventually on the 17th of August, after the A-level results, i.e. those results that were actually algorithm generated but published, Gavin Williamson then conducted a policy U-turn in line with what the Scots and the Welsh position were, and declared that the results would be scrapped in England. Now, that was because of the savage downgrading that had taken place and the unfairness that was manifest. He did, however, say that the teacher assessments alone would be used, except where the algorithm provided them with a higher mark than the teacher-generated predictions. Now, this had the effect of guaranteeing a massive and disproportionate advantage still to the inflation of grades enjoyed by private schools. That wasn't the most serious consequence, though. The serious consequence was that his U-turn came too late for thousands of A-level students who had already made choices about universities based upon the grades they were initially awarded by the algorithm, rather than the new system of teacher assessments. Now, that having been done and said, in terms of, well, what was the outcome to all of this, in terms of Gavin Williamson's handling, a Tory former minister, Stephen Hammond, called the A-level results grading system appeals process a shambles. And he was speaking about the appeals process. Mr. Hammond, the MP from Wimbledon, said, so it looks unfortunately like it's gone very rapidly from some clarity into a shambles. And this is not the actions of a body talking about Ofqual that seem to know what it's doing. Various other Tory MPs whose own children had been downgraded cast aspersions about Gavin Williamson's competence in this matter, and he himself acknowledged that there were significant inconsistencies in the grading process and apologised for the distress caused. However, he remained, in keeping with the position of all members of this government, in that he refused to resign despite his cack-handed, politically humiliating mishandling of this one task he was given. And that's where we left it. In terms of where we move on from there, we see that students have gone into universities. Those universities were meant to be providing FaceTime tuition groups and lectures. However, very quickly we move into the approach of a second lockdown, and our students were effectively incarcerated and asked to work from remotely, really, causing massive expense to their own families, and also posing a problem of having all these students in one place, a serious infection risk, and with the problem of them maybe having to return home and spreading that, metastasizing around the country. In whatever circumstances we look at, it's hard to see how this government has handled our students' education any other way than entirely negligently. And I rest my case on that.
Thank you. Alexi, can I come to you and ask you to present the case to the defence?
Certainly, thank you.
You don't have to call me Your Honour.
My lord. In 1988, the British poet James Fenton wrote a poem called The Mistake. Its first stanza reads as follows: "With the mistake, your life goes in reverse. Now you can see exactly what you did, wrong yesterday and wrong the day before, and each mistake leads back to something worse." Looking back at the A-level fiasco, it's easy to cast blame on the government for overseeing it. But Fenton's poem is about self-recrimination in retrospect, when the facts are all set out in front of you. In contrast, when the government's behaviour over A-levels is looked at contemporaneously, in other words, at the time the key decisions were taken, its decisions become much easier to understand. So let's take it in sequence. On the 18th of March 2020, the government decided to cancel all exams in England due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the same day, it announced that schools would close at the end of that week. Both decisions, I would submit, were reasonable. Remember, at that point, no one knew much about how the virus was being transmitted or which cohort would be most symptomatic. Schools seemed like super spreader events waiting to happen. Indeed, researchers at Imperial had that week specifically recommended that school closures could help flatten the curve. So at that moment, the government had a choice. It could have scrapped grades altogether as well, but this was unthinkable. For better or worse, exam-generated grades are regarded as the ultimate assessment of a young person's ability. Businesses use grades to decide who to employ. Universities use them to predict how well a student will do in their degree. They are a critical currency amongst young people, facilitating their passage into adult society. So some sort of grading had to be maintained. So here we are. The government wanted to keep grades, but had decided quite reasonably to scrap exams and to close schools. So how should they then grade pupils fairly? One option was to use predicted grades, those used by teachers to form the basis of university applications each year. But there were massive problems in doing this. Firstly, it's just not fair. The standard applied by one school might be very different from the standard applied by another. Second, there's strong evidence that in the round, teachers are too generous. And you can see this because when this year's A-level grades were eventually determined on the basis of teacher predicted grades, the number of grade A's was 13% higher than in 2019. So the government had another thing to consider in that respect. If teachers were allowed to determine grades in 2020, what would happen in 2021? The later cohort would have grades that looked substantially worse than the year before. It would have undermined the whole process. So what then were the remaining options for the government in these circumstances? Luckily, they were able to draw on the expertise of an independent body set up specifically to regulate qualifications and exams across England. Ofqual's role is to maintain standards and confidence in qualifications. There is no one better placed to come up with a solution that would fairly distribute grades in extraordinary circumstances while ensuring that grade inflation was, as far as possible, avoided. So what happened? Ofqual came up with their now famous algorithm. Essentially, exactly as has been said, it asked teachers to rank and grade students and then combined those rankings and grades with an average of the school's past 3 years of results in order to distribute grades consistently with previous years. Now, in principle, the use of a standardization algorithm could have been an effective way to solve a difficult problem at a massive scale when there were no easy options. And certainly those who worked on the algorithm subjected it to extensive validation, enough to fill a 3,319-page document. Based on internal metrics, it seemed to justify its usage. The methodology was also supported by independent experts, non-governmental bodies, and some newspaper editors. The end results, although lower than the teachers' own predictions, actually turned out more positive than in 2019. Now, that is not to say that the algorithm was not deeply flawed. It was, for the reasons that have already been set out. Private schools with smaller class sizes were given higher grades because the algorithm could not apply to small classes. Teacher predicted grades were used instead. More fundamentally, hardworking students at underperforming schools were penalized by the performance of their own schools. That was unfair on an ideological as well as a practical level. However, all this does not make it unreasonable for the government to have turned to Ofqual to get the algorithm right. It was also reasonable for the government to believe that a strong appeals process might ameliorate any injustice. In fact, in August, Ofqual revoked the appeals process only hours after it published it, leaving A-level students in limbo. Let's also look at what happened after the algorithms were scrapped and the grades produced by teachers and schools relied on instead. Many more students met offer requirements as the number of A stars and A's soared, throwing the admission system for universities into overdrive. The ripples from the U-turn could cause disruption to the university system for years. High-performing students have had to accept hundreds more students than they were capable of accommodating. Low-ranking universities missed out because many students achieved higher grades this year, pushing them into higher-ranking universities. And hundreds of extra deferred places now mean that there'll be fewer places for students next year. This is not to say that scrapping the algorithm was wrong. Far from it. It's simply to say that the government had no easy choices, and the evidence shows that it took good faith positions in an extraordinary set of circumstances.
Thanks, Alexi. Can I ask you about one thing, which is the decision to close schools? So I mean, it is Sweden is a place we've heard a lot about recently. The mostly negatively recently, admittedly. But can I ask about? Do you think it was reasonable to? Can you explain why it was reasonable for the government to close all schools in March?
I think that the weight of the scientific evidence at the time suggested that schools should close. I think the government were aware of the problems that would be created if schools were to close. But at the time, you had reports such as Professor Neil Ferguson's specifically mentioning school closures as a way of combating the virus. At that point, we didn't know that old people would be much more disproportionately affected. We didn't really understand that school children would be much less disproportionately affected. We had some glimmer of understanding about that, but it was fundamentally unclear. So in the round, it may seem like a mistake, but the decision to close the schools at the time in March was a reasonable one.
Okay. Can I come to the first of our witnesses to Tilly Brown, Tilly, you're a primary head at Reach Academy Feltham. You've also been involved in the Oak schema, a sort of thing, which is, I mean, it's called an academy, but it's an online teaching resource that's basically attempting to help deliver teaching through the pandemic to kids at home. Can I ask you about the thing I just left off with, Alexi, this decision to close the schools, which and the consequences of it, and whether you feel like work was done to mitigate the worst possible consequences of closing the schools, given that we did close them?
Yes.
So first of all, what were the consequences of closing the schools?
Yeah, so I think the consequence of closing the schools really are twofold, right? Schools serve two purposes, one to educate and one to secure the well-being of the young people in our society. And I think when they made the decision, and I kind of agree with what Alexi just said, I think it was a really difficult decision, but one which was not, at least to me, surprising. We saw a lot of schools across Europe. You mentioned obviously Sweden, which didn't close down their schools, but a significant number of countries had closed their schools, and we were sort of expecting this to happen. I think when we think about mitigating circumstances, there's been a lot of discussion of should the government have outlined online learning, and should they have provided online learning earlier on than in fact they did. And I think this is a really difficult issue because fundamentally it feels like a bit of a red herring to suggest that the government should be telling the teachers how to do their job. We are teachers, we educate. Like many professions during the pandemic, we needed to adapt. But the responsibility for educating my pupils, it seems to me, would always have sat with me. And so I think we don't want to talk too much about the government's role within that. But I think to talk about the two sides, I think one thing that is really key for schools to do that I don't think we did enough of, and I think some of the data about only 23% of private schools and 21% of state primary schools have contacted parents, is the safeguarding of our young people's well-being. The most vulnerable were in schools, but that was a very, very small number in the kind of grand scheme of things. And I think that this is our most important job, and we are, as schools, uniquely placed to do this. We held those relationships prior to the pandemic, and it became apparent pretty quickly that there was acceptable online learning. Oak came about, BBC, other providers, and I think it is disappointing that more parents and more young people weren't contacted kind of as within the period of the pandemic, and I think that might have mitigated a lot of the issues that we're seeing now. So issues with anxiety, issues with parental well-being, issues with parental mental health, if there had been more contact between schools and the communities with which they serve.
Can I ask some sort of practical questions? So Ian Duffy has corrected me that, of course, schools didn't close. They just they closed to the bulk of their students, and they tried to deliver online learning to those while offering basically childcare and some teaching to key workers, children with very specific special educational needs, and some specific cohorts. So can I ask about your what actually was being delivered to the kids who are not in the school?
So I think online, we were using pre-recorded videos. We didn't choose to teach live for a number of issues. I serve a teacher in a disadvantaged community, and our pupils were sharing devices. And I'm sure we will come on to the digital divide issue. But a lot of our pupils were sharing devices. They didn't have access to the broadband that they needed to access those. So that was a big problem for us. But we were providing asynchronous learning. So pre-recorded videos that pupils were doing. They would then submit that. And we were then giving feedback as teachers. And alongside that, we were calling the majority of our families once a week. And those families who had either we internally had flagged or had flagged themselves to us, we were also calling them. And alongside that, we were providing lunches twice a week. So parents would come and pick up, particularly those with access to free school meals. And that for me was really important, because it meant that people in the building were managing to see our families at a 2-meter distance in a really safe way on a regular basis as they came to pick up those lunches.
Can I ask about the digital divide stuff is going to come up a lot, I think. Can I ask about what you feel, how severe it was in your particular case? And also, can I ask about looking at your students now, what sort of, what you think the learning loss has been?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for us, the digital divide is twofold, right? One is the devices, and there's been a lot of talk of giving out laptops. We gave out all our laptops within the first 2 weeks, and that to me is not the greatest problem. Most of our students had some access to some sort of device, obviously being shared between siblings. But for me, I think the biggest issue was access to broadband. And there's been a lot of conversation now about data-free access to educational websites, but that should have happened earlier. It would have had such an impact on disadvantaged pupils had that happened earlier. So that's the digital divide. And I'm afraid, could you repeat the second question?
It was the learning loss, like when you look at your kids now, how far off where you want them to be are you?
So I think it's really difficult to tell because there's always a summer setback, we call it in my school, where over 6-week period, children forget things. I think we have some broad concerns with our youngest pupils, so our 2 to 4 year olds. Independence is a great one, as you can imagine. Living in the community that we do, a lot of our families live in quite small flats. We've seen problems with young children's gross motor and fine motor. We've got concerns around people's weight gain and people's kind of physical health. But I think alongside that, we are concerned in part with the lack of reading that has gone on, I think would be my biggest concern. Obviously, reading, writing, maths, a lot of children have accessed maths. A lot of our children, we feel very confident we can teach them how to write, but reading is a skill like the others, but it takes regular practice. And a lot of our young people have not had access to the books that we would have given them. And that's a big problem and something that we are working on every day. I don't think it's impossible to catch them up, but it's definitely going to take a lot of extra input and resources. But I think it is an error to say every pupil has fallen behind. We all know schools have really finite number of resources. So for us, it's been really about identifying those gaps, either in areas or with particular pupils, and really targeting that support, both adult and financially, to those particular pupils that need it.
Can I ask you a positive question, which is to say, are there things that you're surprised were easier to deliver online that you didn't know about before?
Yeah, I think there have been some real positives when it comes to teacher CPD. So I think teachers aren't often at home for long periods and cannot brush up, therefore, their own subject knowledge. That's often sort of the job that everybody wants to do, but it's always the last one on the list. So I think that was a really great opportunity. And I think secondly, teaching online without a class in front of you, you have to tighten your explanations. You have to think really carefully about what you're teaching and how to break that down into easy and manageable steps. Because in a classroom, your children can't turn you off. Turns out on a device they can. So we thought really hard during the pandemic about how we ensure that the learning is meeting the children where they're at and then building difficulty. Because if it's too difficult, they can't access it, they don't learn, they turn you off. And that was a real risk to us.
Okay, thank you ever so much. Can we go to Peter Hyman from Hounslow to Newham to School 21 in Stratford? Peter's your School 21 is the other end of the age spectrum, right? You're a secondary, right?
We're 4 to 18. We've got
ages as well.
We've got 3 schools in our group.
Okay.
We've got a primary, we've got a secondary, and then School 21 is 4 to 18 in Stratford and Newham. So faces a lot of challenges that have already been talked about.
Well, can I ask about your experience of what Tilly talked about? I think the big questions are really about digital divide and whether the government's efforts to help you bridge the digital divide were adequate. Let's start with that.
Yeah, well, and I really benefited from having seen both sort of ends of the telescope, having worked in government. So, I mean, to start by saying, I think, you can't predict when a pandemic's going to hit, but I think some of the least equipped politicians were in place when it happened to. I mean, Boris Johnson couldn't be least suited for this time that we're faced, nor could Gavin Williamson. And we've all had to suffer as a consequence of that. I mean, if I tell you that there were, at the point when COVID struck, there were 6 civil servants out of 7,000, 6 out of 7,000 in the Department of Education who had anything to do with digital learning. So every other sector in society has been working for 20 years or more to try and think, well, how can that sector adapt to what's going on? But ideologically, the ministers in place at the moment think that anything to do with technology is faddy, is getting away from the teacher-pupil relationship. And therefore, it's not surprising that many schools had not seen that as a priority. So if you're in a one-form entry primary school in a rural part of Britain, it had not been a priority to be able to communicate and provide online resources for your families. So, and I think there's something a bit unfair, incidentally, in your dossier. You refer to some of the data, but it's only for May. So what actually happened was, between March and May, about half the schools in the country were a long way behind in terms of being able to communicate digitally, but they did quickly get better at doing that, get onto Google Classroom and use other things. So it's a bit one-sided that. If you'd surveyed schools 2 or 3 months later, I think they would have been in a very, very different place. But they did find it incredibly difficult, and there was no impetus for government to help people do that. And we found that, I mean, like with Tilly, we were handing out laptops because we did our duty of what was needed at that time. We've talked a lot about exams. The other thing that we faced on the ground, Tilly's referred to it a bit, is just the immense need, social need, the need of poverty. You know, we have got a food bank in our school. We have got teachers donating their salary for parents who've lost their job or are suffering at this time. We've provided other provisions, not just food for those who need it. We're handing out children's toys for younger children because they haven't got anything to play with at home. So we're filling the vacuum of what should have been done by the government at this time. So that's definitely one point. The other point I think is very relevant is just the communication. We can't understate this. I mean, we were told in terms, I've got the quotes from Gavin Williamson, that we're in September on the return of schools, every school would be able to test staff and pupils. Well, in Newham, we haven't been able to. We can a little bit now, and it's nearly the end of November. In September, October, there was no ability to test. What does that mean? It means head teachers are making medical judgments. And what's worse than that, there were 3 points of call for those medical judgments. You could phone the local authority, a Public Health England phone line, or an NHS phone line. Our head teacher phoned all 3 and got completely different pieces of information as to if someone had not tested positive, and someone had presented, we weren't testing, positive, whether to send home the whole year group, a discrete bubble, or no one at all, and sort of take your luck, more or less. So head teachers had that strain of working out what to do at all times. So that's a bit of the sort of wider picture. Can I just say, I know before you come back in, because I just wanted to correct one other thing. There's so much nonsense out there talked about teacher assessment, and it's always inflated. Look, we've got a system, we've got a hybrid system at the moment. Teacher moderation is happening in many subjects for, if you've got children, for many of your children. If you do most creative subjects, art, drama, music, is all assessed by the teacher and then is moderated by an external person so that they check that there's not sort of grade inflation on that. It's doable, it's done the whole time. There's something that, again, you may know about called the extended project qualification, which is worth half an A-level, which a lot of A-level students do and universities love. It's entirely marked in-house by teachers, and then you send off a sample to be moderated externally. So it's not actually rocket science, and people have said we need to move to far greater teacher assessment and then train up even more a kind of army of high-quality moderators who can work with teachers to skill them up in skilled marking and moderation of what they're doing. So that is not beyond us, and many, many other countries do it. And if we undermine that and say only exams matter, we're falling into a big trap. If any of you on this call have children who've got grade 5 at the violin, are you saying that's utterly worthless and meaningless on the grounds that it's assessed by someone and it's not a written exam that's done in the normal way? None of us believe that. We believe it's got some credibility to it. So again, we should stress that. Sorry, Chris.
No, that's all right. Can I ask about your experience of exams as well? Because so you're a relatively new school in terms of you've not had many cohorts complete the full education journey.
Yes, 65% were downgraded from the teacher assessment, and 65%
right
at our school were downgraded, and we had worked incredibly hard to moderate them properly. We hadn't inflated them. We'd actually, we'd played the game completely, fairly. 65 were downgraded, and more to the point, if you're a school that's improving, so it was only our second year of A levels, and the first year our results were, which often happens the first year of a sixth form, not all of our teachers were skilled in A level teaching, so we'd slightly underperformed. So there was no way, as others have said, Alexei said this, there was no way of taking into account that this year we'd skilled ourselves up and we were doing infinitely better. So we were on track to get really good A-level results this year, but that wasn't reflected in an algorithm which gave almost every student the same grade as last year, even though they were completely different students. So that definitely didn't work.
Right. Have you had leavers who have had delayed years going to university or to to other things?
Yeah, I mean, some have deferred. Most of ours, I mean, once again the algorithm had been changed. They went on to what they were doing to university as planned. So most of them did that. Can I just add something else? Because I mean, this whole inquiry is about what went wrong with education, and I think you asked Tilly this as well. There's also quite a lot of what went right with education. And I think, many head teachers and teachers across the country have become, because there's been such a leadership vacuum, and it's also just hard to overstate that, there's a total leadership vacuum from the politicians. And so a lot of the head teachers have been emboldened. They've had a bit of space to think about the purpose of education and have been really on the front foot thinking, actually, we've got to do education differently. The obsession with exams to the exclusion of what the wider qualities of a young person, they're now thinking is not the right way of doing it. I'm part of a group called Rethinking Assessment. If you're interested, please get involved. It's rethinkingassessment.com. That's state schools, independent schools. So you've got all your Etons and St. Paul's involved. You've got universities, you've got academics. And we're thinking about, how do you have a better system? Do we still need a school leaving age at 16 when most young people stay on to 18? Do we need to measure the skills and attributes of a young person, not just their knowledge and exam readiness? All of that is important, and a lot of that is now being rethought in schools, as well as rethinking how we do online provision, as well as rethinking the importance of well-being rather than just academic success. All of these things schools are now thinking about as a result of this period and this upheaval.
Can I ask one thing? So Peter, you're one of the original free school founders, and yep. I think one of the interesting questions about which I think the pandemic has raised is that in the old days, Michael Barber used to go on about how all education systems need a middle tier. They need to have a sort of middle level of management that's big enough to keep things on the straight and narrow. Do you think that Professor Moss has raised this in the comments actually. Do you think we're about to come to her, but do you think there's been difficulty partly because we've removed the local government layer in too precipitously?
I would analyze it slightly differently. I think you do need a middle tier. Otherwise, effectively, you're nationalizing all schools. If you remove the local authority control, then if you haven't got a middle tier, literally all you're doing is everything is run from Whitehall, which no one thinks is a good idea. And the evidence during the pandemic is it's clearly not a good idea. I'd put the problem slightly differently. We've had a school improvement agenda for the last 30 years with very heavy-handed Ofsted, very heavy-handed accountability in league tables. And where we had a massive tail of underachievement when they were brought in, you could see the motivation. But we've still got that same apparatus of a failing education system at a point when 84% of schools are graded, I think it's actually slightly more than that now, graded outstanding or good by Ofsted. So you don't need the sort of sledgehammer of what we've got in place. So we need to move from a school improvement agenda to a school innovation agenda. We need to liberate people to provide the variety, the change, the high quality pedagogy, thinking about an expansive curriculum, thinking about how technology works in education. All of those strands people need to be given the space. And if all they're doing is thinking that Ofsted are coming at no notice, could be any day, and I've just got to get better exam result, then it stifles educational change. And we've just got a system that's just outdated. and we need to modernise it.
Okay, thank you ever so much. Could we come to Professor Moss now? Gemma is she's a professor of literacy, but you have particular interest in assessment as well, and I've seen you in the comments. You have views on everything.
Well, I think views on everything is perhaps a bit of a that's not quite right, but
that's a point of praise.
I would say that I have been tracking literacy policy intensely ever since the new Labour era. And that does mean you get a considerable insight into the way in which the structure of the education system has changed over time. And in particular, I want to echo Peter's judgment that we are in a particular weak place right now. I actually think that much of what is wrong with the current system are the reforms that were introduced after 2010. And in particular, what Gove and Cummings, between the two of them, did at DFE was produce a system which is prone to fall over. It's prone to fragility because of things like the emphasis on the final stage exams. You then take out modular courses, you take out coursework, you downgrade teacher assessment, you leave this system vulnerable. Equally, the way in which, I mean, I don't know if people will remember when Nicky Morgan was at DFE and actually in a position to try and legislate that any school getting forced into special measures would automatically be turned into an academy without even an appeal to the Secretary of State. That was reversed by Damien Hines. Now, that creates a school context where schools themselves are liable to be dumped, taken over, forced into an academy chain that they don't choose to join. All of this adds to the pressure from the testing and the accountability system. So we have an education system which is built for fragility at the moment. Now, my view is that against that innate fragility to the structures we're all trying to work in fact, what happened during the pandemic showed that a lot is right with education on the ground. A lot is right with what schools were able to do under fantastically difficult circumstances. And I think we really have to not get distracted by some of the motifs that have arisen in the media talk about this, one of which is learning loss. I would much rather we use the term learning disruption. There is a good literature on learning disruption. We've summarized it and reviewed it and put it into the Education Select Committee inquiry. Learning loss literature calculates what happens to children when you have planned school closures over the summer holidays. It then extrapolates from that minus sum and produces a scary big number for what will happen in the future. Actually, the learning disruption literature looks quite different. In fact, the most intelligent learning loss literature points out that the children who lose most over the summer holidays, guess what, gain fastest. It's just that nobody checks because they're only looking July and then September. So there is a lot of weakness in all of this. This disruption literature points out, and some of the economists have started getting onto this. In New Zealand, post Christchurch and the earthquake there, they decided to slow down the curriculum on return to schools. They decided to give more space for creative activities for children. They decided to enable children to talk about the experience that they had. There was no knock-on loss further on down the line. So at the moment, we're all getting panicked by the notion of learning loss, which is then going to get judged on those incredibly fragile metrics that are in the assessment system. So you put in National Tutor Programme right in January. In January, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. We've got kids out of school. That isn't not the right timing. They are going to be, I'm sorry, someone's going to have to stop me in a minute, but they're going to be the equivalent of Serco. All right, we're going to be back with Serco because we've got external suppliers who may or may not have the right expertise coming into a school they don't know, when even EEF's own research evidence shows that to work, they have to work with the teachers, they have to align what they do with what's happening in the classroom anyway. I mean, this is where the problems lie. The problems are lying with government and not with schools. Schools did a great job during the pandemic.
Can I, can I, just to check I've understood your argument so correctly? So you think there's a lot that went wrong to increase the fragility of the system, and if you like, 2010 to 2020. So more schools became more standalone. We increased the importance of terminal exams. So missing this chunk of school meant that we couldn't assess anyone because we had no other information. Yep. I would add to that, if I'm allowed to start arguing from the bench, that the banning unconditional offers from universities, which meant that universities had to wait for A-levels before giving out places, also created extra fragility in the system. I guess sort of even if you take the view that you know what, what's done is done. They made a system that wasn't designed to survive a pandemic, but who did? What do you think they should have done in March?
Talked to teachers. It's what they should have done right the way through the entire pandemic. And I know that a lot of teacher unions have been sitting in rooms with DfE and have the sense that DfE pays absolutely no attention to a word they say. And that's the missing bit in all of this. Okay, there's been discussion of the digital issue. I mean, one of the most absurd things this government has done is make a education continuity order, which insists that all schools supply digital education to any child who is self-isolating at home. Actually, there are a lot of children self-isolating at home, as Tilly said, who don't have Wi-Fi access. Even if you manage to get Chrome notebooks to them, I know of a school that has in fact equipped all of its pupils that way. Some parents can't afford to pay for Wi-Fi access. Okay, let's also think about those flats Tilly was talking about, where children are living, where there's maybe 3 or 4 children at home and they're all in a single room. Even if you gave them all Chrome workbooks, they would not be able to interact together in separate lessons with separate teachers. So digital is not the answer. I want to pick up on something else that Tilly said. She was saying that noticing the kids coming back, what she's really aware of is that the reading has gone down. And what she's talking about, how she's explaining that, is the absence of books. Absolutely. Why did not the government just flood kids with books? Yeah, I mean, this is not rocket science. It would have been cheaper. It would have been more efficient. And the fact that the government can't see that is a function to me of what Peter was saying. I'm not arguing for the reconstruction of the old middle tier, but we have to have an organisational structure in education which allows those who think they manage it, because they're sitting on SATs test data, to engage in proper conversations with people who are on the front ground, down on the ground. If they don't engage, they won't know what the problems are. Now, the only reason I'm able to say most of what I'm saying to you today, don't get me wrong, I do have opinions, but it's because we ran a research project through COVID in which we basically asked teachers, what are they doing? We didn't try and add up the number of lessons that have gone missing. We didn't try and add up how many pieces of homework hadn't got returned. We actually wanted to know what teachers were doing. The answer was that they were paying a lot of attention to the wellbeing agenda. A lot of them were actually bothering to find out that everybody is okay at home. If schools weren't going to do that, who else would do it? We called our project a duty of care or a duty to teach, because I saw Zane Powell, head teacher of Weston Primary School, on the news, taking food 8-mile tramp round his patch in Grimsby to ensure that the kids from his school were fed.
That's regular, Gemma, I have to tell you, Zane. Can I ask one thing? As while we have a professor of assessment on the line, I should ask you as well, what should we do this year about exams? I mean, do you think the government's pushing ahead with exams this year is, even set aside what you'd like for the future of examination, what's the minimum problem plan for this year?
Well, I'm not an expert on A-levels and O-levels. A-levels and O-levels currently produce different problems for kids because they're gatekeeping exams. You get somewhere else depending upon what happens on those exams. The most sensible suggestion I've heard early on in all of this, I think after the A-level debacle, Tina Isaacs, who is an assessment expert in UCL, was saying she thought the only way to solve this is actually get into a room, Ofqual, DFE, teachers, teacher unions, parents, anybody who might have an angle around this, and let's thrash out what would be the best options given everything. I mean, it's hard to calculate at the moment, and I think one of the things that does dodge government, and for which I have a minor amount of sympathy, is wishful thinking that the pandemic be over. We still don't know. It's still hard to calculate how much time children will have lost who are tied to courses where there's a finite amount of material you're meant to muster and then be examined on. At the very least, the idea that you refocus on a smaller amount of stuff and then make the judgments on how kids are doing in mastering that amount of stuff seems to me to be more sensible. But elsewhere in the primary school, really, they should be taking every single SATS test out.
Okay, thank you. Can I go back to Peter for one thing? Peter, can I ask what you think about what they should do for the next year? What do you think the standing position for government should be for exams from here? I mean, I've proposed that we should abandon exams. So obviously, I feel like I have a dog in this fight again. But sorry, Alexi. But I think there's
it's not hard if you sit. I mean, as Gemma says, if you sit the right people down, it's not hard to get a good hybrid model. I think you could have a few exams at the end, really pared down. But look, we've got to acknowledge there are people already, children already in parts of the country have just missed so much more than others in a different part of the country. So it's just not a level playing field. And the thing again about teacher assessment is if properly moderated, they can make a more rounded judgment that takes into account what a child has missed and therefore is fairer to that child. And and so I would do a combination of that, and I would accept that some students are not going to necessarily be able to sit even with the delayed exams, and therefore you'll need a plan B for a whole cohort anyway, and therefore you might as well build in the plan B right from the start. So a small amount of exams and then a large amount of properly moderated teacher assessment would be my combination.
Okay, thank you. Can we come to Helen Smith? Who is one of our, I always feel like a local radio DJ at this point in these things. Helen Smith down the line. Helen, you're a parent.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I ask what your experience of lockdown was with regard to education?
If I set what level I'm at, so I've got one child who was due to do his GCSEs. So he was at the end of that, so obviously he had the thing of not knowing how his exams were going to be assessed. So when he saw that the A-levels got changed and the GCSEs might or might not, and it was so close to actually getting his results, that was really stressful, because he just didn't know how his exams were going to be assessed, what results he was likely going to have, how those results were going to be decided, until literally a few days before they arrived. And so, yeah, as a parent, he was quite hard to live with.
Sorry, go on.
So yeah, we had him. The other thing we have now is, so I've got a younger daughter, so she's 13. Her school does the GCSEs over 3 years. So she's just started that. And obviously my son's just started his A-levels. So she was still having to do learning during the lockdown. And her learning was very much dependent on which teacher. So some teachers were very interactive, sending messages and things. Other teachers, we basically heard nothing from them. She got online questions, like a question for each subject, where she just had to click the multiple choice, is what she had for most subjects. One of my friends wasn't able to access the internet at all, and she was actually being given workbooks that each week she went in, collected a box full of books with question papers and things, textbooks, took those home, and then the next week she swapped them over. So the school were trying to put things in place for those that didn't have internet access.
Right.
And then the position we're in now is my daughter's anxiety at going back in September was really high. She didn't feel at all safe. We kept her going through to half term, but at the moment she's off. So technically we're breaking the law because she should be in school. We haven't deregistered her. I don't want to deregister her because I do think the school do an amazing job. So most of the teachers are now being quite good at putting stuff onto the team system. Okay. For us to access work. And then obviously I use the Oak Academy, so I know that one, to subsidise what the teachers are sending, but obviously we're living in this thing that we don't know if any day we could get a fine dropped onto us. Is that so? If you don't mind me asking, is she, you obviously can tell me to sod off, but is she is it anxiety about the disease, or is it just having been sort of lost the habit of school? It's anxiety because she doesn't feel the environment is safe when she's walking in the corridor, and she's literally, the school, I'm not criticising the school here because they literally have done what they can. They've done staggered start times, staggered end times. They're trying to get teachers to move between classrooms where they can rather than the pupils. They've changed it that students are using some of the staff stairways to try and separate them out. So it really isn't a criticism of what the efforts the school have made. But at the end of the day, you have a certain number of students to fit in with a certain size building, and you can't change that. When she realised that it's only those students that are sitting directly next to a positive case that are sent home, it's not the whole class. That's what made her really feel unsafe in the school environment. Okay, can I thank you ever so much, Helen. So in the chat, Joe Forster, who I think we're trying to pester to see if we can get her to go on camera, has made this wouldn't be an education conversation in England without someone pointing out that we've not mentioned further education. And actually further education remains one of the, I mean, it is horrific how little attention it gets, and unfortunately people like me keep doing it. But not least since actually we had lots of people sitting at home on furlough, and who actually would have been might have benefited from the kind of infrastructure that the FE system can provide. Joe, I see you're now on camera. Can we? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Can we help you unmute? Oop. Hang on. There we are. Sorry. There you go, Joe.
Right.
So yeah, so FE.
I'm not talking about FE.
Ah.
I'm not talking about further education. I'm talking about community adult education.
Right.
Which is based in community settings, which is has suffered an incredible demise pre-COVID over the last 10 years. It was eventually, it has different strands, of which the economic has become the dominant strand of learning, at the expense of the social purpose and the democratic strands. The social purpose strands that I'm actually talking about here are the ones that enable people where the formal education system has actually failed them, and enables them to return to learn at a local level and provides them with learning opportunities. Now, these are people who are in the lower socioeconomic brackets. Perhaps some of them could even be your key workers, doing cleaning in schools, doing, cooking, in the kitchens, working with children in creches, etc. And they would come into the centres in very disadvantaged areas and engage with a whole wide range of learning opportunities that were established by different providers, including, how to improve their health and their well-being, how to improve their literacy. Because the centres have now been closed down, these people are even further disengaged because they can't meet up in groups. they're a part of the digital divide because they haven't got internet access in their homes, they don't have equipment, and they would come into the centres to actually do IT, to access the internet, to actually make applications with support for welfare, make applications for jobs with support, and also get health information. Now, all of that has disappeared. So if Tortoise Media is serious about this particular socioeconomic group that has suffered so badly in this crisis, we need to try to, in some way, reorganize and rebuild in our communities the centres again, and also adult education, because COVID has fragmented it, and the voluntary sector have played a massive role in this to make sort of community adult education rise to address the needs of local people who are disadvantaged over the years, since we've had mass unemployment through deindustrialization, austerity, and the present time. And the voluntary sector have provided tremendous amount, as you know, of mutual aid, different types of mutual aid, all kinds of mutual aid in the communities. But we've lost access to learning for our adults at that level. And it's crucial that it's reinstated. The schools have been reinstated, further education has been reinstated, the universities have been reinstated, but community adult education has not been reinstated, and it needs to be.
Thank you. I mean, it tells you something, Jo, that when you talk about community education, I immediately assume you meant FE. That tells you how you how far, we've got, how far we have to, No, I take your point completely. Especially as community education is very important, particularly for the communities that have been hardest hit by the virus itself. Can we've just run over time, but actually I was wondering if I could go to Tilly for one last thought. Tilly. So you wanted to add something. Hello?
Did I? Hello?
Oh, sorry. We had messages crossed. Yes. Did you?
I'm very happy to add something, but I don't know what you'd like me to add about. That's absolutely fine. I think we were talking about a little bit about how the work of schools in the community, and the fact that actually I so agree with the points just made about the importance of ensuring that we are working with the other teams available in the community, working closely with social care, working closely with partners who are providing adult education, just to ensure that this linked up approach, I don't think it's ever been more important. We similarly had a food bank in our school, like Peter was mentioning earlier. And I think really hopefully one of the bonuses of this is that we see communities come together. We see schools take their focus to the centre of a community and to enable everybody to work together for the benefit of the children and their families in disadvantaged communities. And I think that would be a big hope of mine coming out of this period, is that sense of community, that sense of all the individuals working together for the good of those around them might last for a long period of time. So I'm not sure if that's what was being got at, but that was something that we've been talking about in the chat.
Thanks ever so much. So I think I'll sum up quickly. I think I have to tell Alexei, I don't think he should go back to the bar. Unfortunately, I think his client is going to get convicted with some very extreme prejudice. But I think that's the case, I'm afraid, rather than the argument, which I thought was deft and elegantly made. I find Tasneem's focus on the exam stuff is a thing that actually it's really difficult to come up with a it's really difficult to come up with a sort of a good explanation for how they got into the mess that they got into over exams. Like I feel like it was a starting point for everyone's conversations, was that the government had obviously screwed up on the grading process, despite, as I say, Alexei's excellent endeavours to dig them out of that hole unarguable case. I think the in a sense, actually, I came out of that thinking that I hadn't really considered, as Gemma put it, that how easy it would have, how many things the government didn't do that they could have done relatively easily, like sending out books to children. You know, I'd heard, you know, one of the things you hear a lot from teachers is the importance of Wi-Fi, the importance of space, and how children, particularly from tough backgrounds, struggle for those things, even if they have, you know, the device to work on. And the extent to which that wasn't sort of thought through is a thing that sort of came through very clearly. But as Gemma says, actually, maybe, and to Peter actually in the comments, maybe we should be more optimistic about the fact that the losses that have been suffered aren't permanent. There's no, you know, that these things can be made up, that children are resilient, and they can be caught up to speed. Thank you to Joe in particular for raising the point that we've, like, the many parts of the education system we missed today. Community education is definitely one of them. One of the bigger community education providers was recently defunded altogether. And I think we didn't talk about further education enough, as ever. This is England, unfortunately. This is how this country works. I'd really be keen for us to sort of think about how we move to a society that is a bit less, a bit more forgiving of people who don't take their first chance, and how we find further routes through for people whose GCSEs aren't perfect and don't, you know, come straight off. I'd like to thank our two lawyers, Tasneem and Alexi. Can I thank Peter, Tilly, and Gemma for their contributions, also to everyone who contributed, and to my co-host today, Patricia, who I forgot to point out to you at the start of this. Thanks ever so much. As I say, this is occasionally like a local radio TV show. I'm a local radio show, and I'm just not very good at it. So I'll speak to you soon. Take care.